But moving on to energy now, the Prime Minister in her leadership election campaign repeatedly criticised the installation of solar panels on farmland. And now the government is reportedly considering measures to curb the rollout of this fast-growing technology, despite reservations from Jacob Rees-Mogg's business department, leaving BEIS, as it's known, and the Environment Department, DEFRA, at loggerheads. Industry bosses have warned that around £20 billion of investment could be at risk if a solar farm ban on agricultural land goes ahead. But is it really going to go ahead? What are the arguments here? I'm delighted to be joined by Chris Hewitt, who's Chief Executive of Solar Energy UK, joining me live from Westminster. Thank you so much for making the time this morning, Chris. I suppose the first question here is how big a sector could solar farms be in this country? This country's not seen to be particularly sunny, and there is the argument that there's a food security issue. Does the government have a point in saying that perhaps we're not best suited to mass solar farms?
Well, solar technology has been a global success story. The costs of generating power from solar have fallen by 90% since 2010. And yes, the economics of solar work equally well in the UK as it does in the rest of Europe and most of the world. So that's really not an issue. The food security issue is also really a misnomer. Even if we were to build as much solar as required for the net zero targets by 2050, we only need 0.5% of the UK land base, which is a very small percentage. So it's really not a food security threat.
Why then do you think that the government is exploring this? I mean, we do understand that there are differences of opinion within the government. The business department much more in favour of letting people do what they want with their land, but the Environment Department suggesting that there may be this expansion of definition of agriculturally important land where a ban may be enforced. Why then, if solar is so much cheaper now, and indeed, if solar is desirable for the UK climate, why is this ban being considered?
That's a question for the government. We're a little baffled why this is the case. It seems to be that the Department for Rural Affairs is talking about forcing farmers to only grow food on some of their less productive land. It's really, we all agree that solar shouldn't be going on the most productive land, and solar doesn't go on grade 1 or grade 2. But 3B is a large proportion of flat areas of the country, which are very suitable for solar and less suitable for a lot of food growing. The other point to make is that agriculture is often integrated with solar, so we will see grazing on a lot of solar farms in the UK, and particularly on that 3B land.
Do you talk to many farmers in your role as Chief Executive of Solar Energy UK? Do you get a sense of what farmers want to do with their land? Because it does seem peculiar, as if there's sort of artificial lines being drawn up here between those who want energy and those who want farming. Because surely I would suppose farmers who are putting solar panels on their land, or who are applying to do so, want to put solar panels on their land.
Absolutely, by definition, they wouldn't be making those applications if they didn't want to do so. We do talk to a lot of farmers, and our members obviously talk to a lot of farmers. We find that what happens is the solar revenues are supporting their farming business. It's giving them an extra diversification of revenues. It supports them sort of producing food in other parts of their land. So the NFU have been very clear that they support solar. The Country Landowners Association are very clear they don't want to see grade 3B land declared best and most versatile. So it's actually hard to find any organisation within the farming community who's in favour of what DEFRA seems to be proposing.
Extraordinary. I wonder, in this show we'll be talking a little bit more about what Liz Truss called the anti-growth coalition a little bit later on in the show. I wonder, Chris Hewitt, if you would be so bold as to suggest that perhaps those who suggest a ban on solar farms in this country would be contributing to a so-called anti-growth coalition.
I think that's a fair point. It is something we've said. So there's 20 billion of investment, which is a threat here, and we have an energy security crisis driven by the price of gas. So the more solar we build, the cheaper we can drive our energy bills, and that's going to increase our energy independence, it's going to increase our economy, and it's going to support lower bills. So it really is quite baffling why the government would make these moves. And well, I suspect they won't in the end. I think the Treasury's view on this will be very interesting, because the Treasury, of course, is now subsidising a lot of the energy generation in the country, they know that the more clean, cheap, private capital invested renewables we get on the system, the lower that cost will be to themselves and the taxpayer.
Now, I suppose one of the big arguments against solar, and indeed against wind, is that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. Is it sensible for this country to base so much of its energy needs on what is, frankly, an intermittent source of power?
You'd be surprised to know that maybe the developers of wind and solar do know exactly what the weather patterns are, and it's a very predictable sort of energy. Interestingly, the wind and solar actually do tend to balance each other out. So when there's high pressure in this country, there's generally clear skies, so you get more solar, so that helps. We also need energy storage, we also need other forms of balancing technologies. And in the short term, we will need those fossil fuels to fill the gaps. But we only really want the fossil fuels to fill the gaps where we can't get cheap renewables. And the speed with which renewables will be deployed, both offshore wind, onshore wind and solar, is quite sort of breathtaking. And I think we will see a reduction of dependence on gas very, very quickly over the next decade.
Well, it's a really, really fascinating issue, and interesting to hear that the NFU and lots of farmers who, of course, are applying for these things actually do support solar on agricultural land or on the less intensively used agricultural land. This will be a very, very interesting one to follow. But for now, Chris Hewitt, Chief Executive of Solar Energy UK, thank you so much for joining me live from Westminster.